Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members and guests of the committee. I realize the material that we're covering is highly complex and technical, so please feel free to stop us if you have any questions. We covered for you earlier how closure plans are normally developed and approved through the permit process. Because we were moving to deny Exide's permit, the facility now is closing without completing the permit process. I do want to point out that federal law requires that the closure be completed. It also requires that Exide fund that closure. So the process is going forward because it's required by federal law, and it's being paid for by Exide, not by DTSC. DTSC is just enforcing that law. At the same time, we're using other authorities, as I mentioned earlier, to move ahead now with the residential cleanup on a parallel track, so they're not in competition with each other. As far as the closure of Exide goes, as I mentioned, there's the normal process, but because Exide didn't complete the permit process, they don't have an already approved closure plan. So instead of the normal process, the submittal, review, and approval process for Exide's closure plan and the associated financial assurance is structured through an enforcement order that we issued that was approved by the bankruptcy court last March. That makes this closure process somewhat unique. It's also unique for a couple of other reasons. Air monitoring done by the South Coast Air Quality Management District has shown that there's a very high likelihood of lead dust emissions during the closure activities if we're not vigilant about containment and control. So close coordination is therefore needed between the Air District and the department, as well as with other regulatory partners, to ensure that closure does not impact public health or the environment. In addition, as you've heard, the communities around the facility are understandably upset, and they're concerned about the potential impacts of the closure on their lives. They also have a wealth of local knowledge and practical suggestions that can improve the closure process. So we're taking a number of steps to engage and involve these communities in the decision-making process. Ann Carroll, Senior Staff Counsel at DTSC, is going to explain to you how the enforcement orders from 2014 and 2015 structure the closure and financial assurance. She's also going to give you an overview of the proposed closure plan itself and the process that's remaining for its approval. Then when she's done, there are a few points I want to make about some of the extra steps we're taking to promote the best outcome we can for communities that are affected by Exide's operations.
Thank you, Director Lee, and good afternoon, Chair. Can you hear me? All right, get closer. Good afternoon, Chair, members, and guests of the committee. I thank you for this opportunity to address you this afternoon. As Director Lee stated, I'll be providing an overview of Exide's obligations under the 2014 order as amended in 2015. For simplicity's sake, I'm going to be referring to it as the order. Specifically, I'm going to address Exide's obligations to provide funding for corrective action for residential, industrial, and on-site, and also closure of the facility. I'll also be presenting a review of Exide's proposed draft closure plan, including the process and next steps. So I first want to bring your attention to the fact that although DTSC issued the order to Exide after it had gone into bankruptcy, DTSC preserved its rights against Exide for cleanup of contamination at and from the facility. Exide's bankruptcy does not protect it from obligation to pay for the cleanup of on-site or off-site contamination due to releases from the former Exide facility. The order also requires Exide to submit 3 corrective measure studies to DTSC to address residential, industrial, and on-site corrective action.
They're having a hard time hearing.
Okay. Please let me know if you can't hear me. I can't tell.
This hearing is being televised on Cal Channel, so they got to make sure the audio people could hear back home.
Okay. Is this better? Okay. So they're required to submit 3 corrective measure studies to DTSC, and from each of these studies, DTSC will select the appropriate actions to be taken. The first one is the residential corrective measure study, which is due in May of 2019, and it'll address the residential properties impacted by Exide. Exide is also required to submit a corrective measure study for off-site industrial areas around the former facility and investigate them for contamination. The study is due in November 2019. Finally, they're required to submit an on-site corrective action measure study by December 31st, 2016. The order also provides that Exide is required to fund all of the residential, industrial, and off-site corrective action activities that DTSC determines to be appropriate based upon these studies. Specifically, Exide is required to create 3 separate trust funds. These include the Residential Off-Site Corrective Action Trust Fund, an Industrial Off-Site Correction Active Trust Fund, and On-Site Corrective Action Trust Fund. As of May 30th, 2015, Exide has deposited $9 million into the Residential Off-Site Corrective Action Trust Fund. But as previously mentioned, these funds have been expended on cleaning up residential properties already. Prior to the approval of the residential corrective measure study, Exide is also required to make 3 additional payments into the trust fund, totaling $5 million. Those are due November 1st, 2018, March 1st, 2019, and March 1st, 2020. I would just want to underscore that these funds are just the beginning of what Exide will be required to pay to address residential corrective action. Because following DTSC's approval of the corrective measure study, Exide will annually deposit monies into the trust fund, and these payments will continue for up to 10 years, and they depend on the schedule adopted for the DTSC selected residential corrective action activities. For the Industrial Offsite Corrective Action Trust Fund and the On-Site Corrective Trust Fund, those monies shall equal the cost estimates prepared by DTSC for the actions selected. Like the Residential Trust Fund, payments will be made into these funds on an annual basis for up to 10 years and depend on the schedule adopted by the DTSC selected corrective actions. For closure, the order also requires Exide to pay for all closure costs. The closure costs, as stated, are estimated to be $38.6 million. But in addition to paying for the implementation of the closure plan, the order requires Exide to establish financial assurance in the amount of $26 million. That financial assurance includes an existing surety bond valued at approximately $11 million. That bond shall be maintained or renewed to meet the closure and post-closure cost estimate. It also includes a trust fund that's to be funded in an aggregate amount of $14,750,000. As Director Lee mentioned, the amendment to the order in 2015 accelerated Exide's payment deadlines to deposit funds into the trust fund. To date, Exide has deposited $8,250,000 into the closure trust fund, and the final deposit is due March 31st, 2018. So normally, under our practices, a facility is allowed to draw down on their closure trust fund and to pay for the closure activities. But Exide is unique in that they are not allowed to seek reimbursement from this fund. So for Exide, when the closure is complete, the closure trust funds will be used to fund the post-closure requirements, and any funds not needed for post-closure will then be rolled into the corrective action trust funds that I discussed. So I've talked about what they're required to fund under the order, but I also want to briefly touch on how the corrective action measures and the closure activities are separate. They're separate, but they're interrelated. And Deputy Director Rothschild referred to a chart in her presentation, and it provides a nice visual example of what I'm talking about. So it's this one. So corrective action and closure proceed on separate paths, and they have separate regulatory and technical requirements. Corrective action addresses releases of hazardous waste or hazardous waste constituents at and from a facility, regardless of the time of the release. Closure specifically addresses the hazardous waste management units, the equipment or the structures at the facility. Under closure, these units are safely closed by removing, transporting, treating, storing, and disposing of all hazardous waste. So although these are two separate projects, The projects for Exide are related and they are running concurrently. Results from the corrective actions may inform how the closure process should be implemented. However, the closure process does not affect the corrective action. These projects are also subject to the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, and to date, DTSC has prepared documents for residential corrective action and a draft environmental impact report for the draft closure plan in order to comply with environmental review requirements. In complying with CEQA, DTSC is using tools provided for under CEQA that allow us to build or tier from prior CEQA documents that involve project components that are part of a larger program. In this way, the early steps of the larger program can proceed before the specific impacts of the later phases are known. So as these impacts are discovered and additional details are obtained, DTSC will update and supplement its analysis for cumulative impacts. And then this will result in DTSC's approach results in we not having to wait until all the details of the proposed corrective action and closure projects are known, which would lead to delay and undue complexity of the environmental document. DTSC's goal is to avoid any undue delay with respect to corrective action and closure at the facility. So I want to go into what actually is involved with the closure plan that's being proposed. And I'm going to do this very briefly as it is a very technical document. So as I've said, closure plan addresses potential impacts from hazardous waste management units at the facility, and it does not include the other areas of the facility that are being addressed under corrective action, specifically the 2002 corrective action consent order issued by DTSC. The draft closure plan currently proposes to effectuate closure in 2 phases. In the first phase, the plan proposes that it include how to prevent fugitive emissions and comply with air quality standards during closure activities, perform air monitoring, hazardous waste inventory removal, the removal and cleaning of hazardous waste management equipment and structures, the disposition of those equipment and structure, and other components that are removed. In phase 2, it's proposed to be a contingent closure plan. So the phase 1 results will determine the areas and depth of the foundation and soil removal and will be used to develop a post-closure plan. If Exide proposes to leave waste in place, they will be required to submit a post-closure permit application and any required supporting documents. Also, after phase 2, none of the former hazardous waste management equipment or structures will remain on the site. So DTSC has received significant public feedback on certain elements of the proposed closure plan. As the Director Lee has stated, we've worked with the community and we've received input from the Community Advisory Group prior to noticing the draft closure plan. We've taken that feedback into consideration and included that in revisions provided to Exide. One of the significant elements, as Exide has brought up, is the removal of lead from the kettles. And I think it's important to note that each one of these kettles is approximately 2 stories tall, and each has a capacity of approximately 90 tons. 6 of the kettles contain little to no lead and are being proposed to be removed by crane and transported to an off-site recycling facility. The other 7 are too heavy for the crane that exists, and the floor of the building cannot support a larger one. Therefore, the draft environmental impact report evaluates the alternatives discussed by Exide's representative, the manual removal of lead, water cutting, and the reheating of the kettles. So after the public comment period, DTSC will determine the appropriate action to take regarding those kettles based on comments received. The other elements of the closure plan for which DTSC has received strong messages from the community are the identification of trucks transporting hazardous waste, the truck routes to be taken, and they're currently proposed to avoid the residential areas, protection of public health during closure, specifically to address air and water quality, the regulatory oversight of the closure activities, community outreach, and the interaction of closure and corrective action processes. And these specific points were going to be addressed more thoroughly by our Assistant Director for Environmental Justice, Ana Mascareñas, and Director Lee. So those are the basic proposals in the draft closure plan on a very generic level. And I want to address what DTSC's role will be regarding finalizing the closure plan and the next steps. So I want to draw your attention to the graphic provided in your materials this afternoon. It's on page 4, and it's entitled DTSC's Closure Process. So DTSC's role is to ensure that the closure plan meets regulatory standards and it's protected of public health and the environment. And the order issued to Exide and applicable regulations require DTSC to approve a closure plan prior to closure beginning, and that the draft closure plan be noticed for public review and comment before a final decision is made. On December 8th, 2015, DTSC publicly noticed the draft closure plan and draft EIR. The notice also notified the public of a hearing that is going to be held in Commerce at the Commerce City Council chambers. That will be on February 3rd, 2016 from 6 to 9 p.m. At that hearing, a court reporter will be present to accurately record all comments received from the public. Also, in response to multiple requests from the community, DTSC has extended the public comment period, and it will run for an additional 45 days, ending on March 28th, 2016. I want to point out that we are currently in the midst of the public comment period, and DTSC needs to ensure that the comments it receives are documented either in writing or at this hearing that's coming up on February 3rd. And we need to do this in order to make sure that we can consider those comments and respond. So on behalf of the DTSC staff, I respectfully request that any comments made today by the chair, members, guests, or the public be submitted to DTSC in writing, or that the commenters elect to participate in our hearing so that those comments can be considered and responded to. So, as I've stated, DTSC at the close of the comment period will have to draft a written response to any comments received. And after consideration of those comments, DTSC will be modifying Exide's draft closure plan and issuing a final closure plan in conjunction with a final EIR. So per the order, Exide will then be required to implement the approved closure plan within 30 days of DTSC's approval. DTSC's permitting and enforcement staff will then monitor the implementation of the closure plan along with those third-party oversight parties that have been provided for and proposed in the draft closure plan. So this concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to respond to any questions that you may have.
Mr. Chairman, as I mentioned, there are a couple of additional points that I just want to highlight for the committee. First of all, DTSC is absolutely committed to safeguarding communities and protecting the environment throughout this closure process. We're also working hard to engage community members in the closure and the cleanup in the communities. To ensure that the air emissions are fully curtailed, we've partnered closely with the South Coast Air Quality Management District, who you're going to hear from in a moment, throughout the development and the review of the draft closure plan. The buildings at the facility will be tented and kept under negative pressure during the deconstruction process. Air pollution control equipment will be maintained operational throughout the deconstruction, and air monitoring equipment will be stationed around the facility to alert us of any emissions that are escaping, and then operations will be immediately stopped if this occurs until adjustments can be made to prevent further releases. DTSC is requiring special handling and transport procedures to prevent contamination from being carried off-site on vehicles, equipment, parts, or debris. We're requiring thorough decontamination of equipment and parts being removed from the site with confirmation testing. The truck loading will occur in a containment structure with negative pressure, and the vehicles are washed before leaving. All water used is treated on-site, and the treatment system will be the last part of the facility to be removed. Hazardous waste will be contained during transport by wrapping the material, and trucks carrying hazardous waste from the site will carry identification so community members can observe their transport and report any trucks that don't follow approved routes. We are requiring oversight of all closure activities by a third-party independent monitor. DTSC has also taken a number of steps to better engage the affected communities. The advisory group formed by DTSC and the South Coast Air Quality Management District has held 5 public meetings and 3 technical study sessions so far on the closure plan. Staff has regular contact with the technical advisor we co-funded for the community members for the advisory group to answer his questions and make sure he has all of the information he needs. We have consulted outside experts that have been recommended by the advisory group. In addition, the department has briefed the Commerce City Council. We held a scoping meeting for the EIR. We held more than a dozen separate meetings to explain the soil testing process, tests, results, and cleanup. We have identified mechanisms to train and involve community members in soil sampling in residential areas, and we are exploring opportunities to do something like that with aspects of the closure process. We expect the closure process to take 34 months once the plan is approved. We will continue to work with the advisory group throughout that process to make sure communities are fully informed about the closure and that we engage with them to identify issues as they arise and develop appropriate solutions. We will also provide status updates on our website, and I would be happy to come back and brief your committee on the closure progress in the future if you would like. Thank you for your attention. We would be happy to answer your questions.
We normally leave questions to the end before our last panelist, but Assemblymember McCarty has a few questions before he leaves, and I want to make sure he's able to answer those or get answers to those.
Sure. Thank you for accommodating me. My questions are for Exide, and knowing that you purchased this this property in 2000, correct?
Correct.
And that it was rehabbed in the early 80s, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
knowing what you know now, you may not have purchased it 16 years ago.
That might be true, yes.
Yeah. Okay. I guess my question is, I know that you're a major provider of this type of efforts across the nation, so you're experts in this. What we heard earlier from the for the first panel, actually the second panel, because you're back. It was very moving hearing from the families and so forth. Just want to know from your experience, from your other facilities that you have across the country, or that you purchased. Is this typical to see the hot spots in the locations so close to the facility, or is this abnormal?
Our other facilities are controlled by the same federal standards as far as ambient control and monitoring, and they meet and comply with all of those ambient standards. So it's not. So
this is abnormal, you think, for this site?
I know our other sites all comply. I've been with Exide for about two years now, and working mostly in Vernon, but I have managed to get to the other sites, and again, compliance is a key issue for us.
Well, I guess maybe I'll ask just in plain English. On your other sites, do you typically have homes a mile or so away have problems with so much lead in their yards and so forth?
No, we don't. But they're not in heavily urban areas like Vernon. Our Cannon Hollow facility is well out in the country on many, many acres, and there are not communities close by. There's not other urban industry. There's not lead-based paint, and they certainly do not have the huge highway network that's running around L.A. So it's a much different environment that our other facilities are in. Besides just they're similar smelters, but the urban environment here is very close in. I mean, this site was built in 1922 out in the country. The community has been built around it, and if we were going to site a new smelter today, you probably wouldn't put a smelter where it is, but. The facilities are in good shape.
And I assume that the state and federal or local regulators wouldn't probably allow this in
an
urban setting. As far as the testing, I know this is not necessarily your expertise or something that's in your control, but do you think that the timeline of going out there and doing the tests is appropriate? Is it or is it?
The testing of the soil?
Yeah, and the homes.
Yeah, I mean, we went out as a part of the RCRA permitting process, and we had to look for the areas where we potentially could have impacted. So that's where we selected the northern and southern areas. And then in talking with DTSC and the development of what we were doing and what we were finding, we tested expanded areas, and we did that in a pretty judicious time frame, testing them all. There was a lot of work to be done to make sure we had the right testing criteria, we had the right sampling methods. So there was a lot of back and forth with the agencies to make sure the work plans were correct. But then it's pretty involved to go out and test these homes. We're taking 10 to 12 samples per yard. You have to go through a chain of custody. There's a lot of technique in making sure you get good samples and good data. And we went through the 200 homes that we did in the smaller area, and then we probably done 10,000 samples throughout the area, extending out along the transacts out to, I think, 7.5 miles. But there's been an awful lot of sampling that was done, and the sampling was done pretty quickly.
Okay. I lost my expert here, who's a neighbor next door, but I think that she mentioned earlier that there's upwards of 1,000 homes still to be tested, the desire. That's what the supervisor mentioned as well.
Well, we agreed to do a certain amount of testing, and we did that. And then DTSC and the county are doing additional testing.
Okay, thank you. And then I guess my question for our state folks here, I know that part of the arrangement for the closure is accepting X amount of payment to do the closure and to do the testing and so forth. And then there was the request from the community and the local elected official for X amount of dollars from our state budget. And people who are watching or maybe observing this may be saying, well, why would the state pay any more money to this? Shouldn't these folks be paying that extra $70 million? And so how would you answer that?
Thank you, Assemblymember. It comes back to what I was mentioning earlier, which is if we wanted to wait to have Exide fund this directly, we would wait for their study to be done in 2019, and then the funding for the work that comes out of that study would be available, and the actual implementation would begin. Our sense is that these communities should not have to wait that long for the work to begin. And so we are using separate authority under our cleanup program to go out and sample and prioritize properties and begin the cleanup. And we're documenting everything we're doing. We're collecting all the information that we need so that we can show Exide's responsibility to pay at the end of the day. And there will be a day of reckoning when that happens. But in the meantime, if we want to address the needs of the communities that have spoken so far here today, and I'm sure we'll speak more, and that we have heard from on many occasions, at least I have in the last year, we felt we needed to move ahead and put state money on the line to get the process going, with the expectation that we will recover costs from those who are responsible. Exide is at the top of that list, but we're also looking, as they have pointed out, this is a heavily industrial area, so where we can identify other contributors, we will hold them accountable as well.
Okay, thank you.
And again, Mr. McCarthy, since you're about to leave, Barry Wallerstein from the South Coast Air Quality Management District. I just want you to know that these types of facilities do cause hotspots, and there are hotspots across the country related to these facilities. This is the worst serious serial violator that I've ever dealt with in my 30-year career plus, and I think the answer that you were given was less than candid.
And also to make clear for the public that these are parallel tracks, that the mitigation and the cleanup of the actual site should be moving at the same time and as expeditiously, hopefully, as the cleanup and the testing of the homes. And there was initial numbers that came out, but now DTSC is saying there's 10,000 homes that need to be tested, and they're committed to that. And that's why it needed to be made clear that these are parallel tracks. Both should be moving forward as expeditiously as possible. But we do have one more panelist, and we have some questions from our vice chair. Mr. Wallerstein, if you could proceed.